Why are we so fascinated by the idea of being stranded on a deserted island? These deserted island stories infiltrate almost every aspect of our culture, from our literature to TV to movies, reality TV, you name it. There's Robinson Crusoe in Lord of the Flies. You have Tom Hanks talking to a volleyball in Castaway.
Well done!
You have a group of random strangers duking it out for $1 million on an island in Survivor.
Travis spoken.
You have Lost, Gilligan's Island, The Swiss Family Robinson, and Wrecked. The list kind of goes on and on. So I'll ask again, why are we so fascinated by this idea of being stranded on a deserted island? Part of it's because we're curious about what happens to people when the rules of society and civilization are stripped away. When there's no rules and norms guiding their behavior, what do people become? Picture yourself in one of these situations. It's just you and, say, a group of 10 other people. Every action that you and your group commit will be known to no one but your group and the nature that surrounds you. So in this hypothetical scenario, how do you think you and your group will behave? Will you all cooperate to gather resources, build shelter, gather food, make fire, and create a rescue plan? Or will the lack of structure, rules, and civilization bring out the worst in you? Do we need the structure and rules provided by society to operate within a good moral framework? Are humans naturally good, or are we inherently corrupt and brutal? These are all questions that Sir William Golding seeks to address in his classic 1954 debut novel, The Lord of the Flies. It's been almost 70 years since this book was first published, but these questions are still worth exploring. So let's take a look. Published in 1954, Lord of the Flies is the classic debut novel by Sir William Golding. The book took a few years after publication to gain notoriety, but since then it has become widely regarded as a classic. After Lord of the Flies, Golding himself would go on to have a very successful career as a writer. In his lifetime, Golding served as a fellow in the Royal Society for Literature. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1983, and was knighted Sir William Golding in 1988 by Queen Elizabeth II for his contributions to British literature. The transcript to his Nobel Prize acceptance speech is available online, and I've included it in the links below. It's actually worth the read. He delves into topics like the novel, the future of the novel, wisdom, and storytelling. At present, Lord of the Flies has sold approximately 14.5 million copies. It's ranked number 41 on Modern Library's top 100 novels. It's ranked number 70 on the BBC's must-read poll, and Time magazine listed it in its list of top 100 best novels ever written. Lord of the Flies is one of my favorite books of all time. I think it is incredible. It is such a fun and enjoyable read. It's also kind of terrifying in a lot of ways. What's up, Cooper? And I'm absolutely pumped to be talking about it, but before we do, I think it is really important to look back at the life of the author who wrote it. No novel can be read in a vacuum because every novel has context. And that context is the macro and micro influences on the person who wrote it. So the author's background, their upbringing, and life experiences play a really important role into understanding certain pieces of literature. And in the case of Lord of the Flies, it is very worth delving into. Sir William Golding started teaching English and philosophy in 1935 at Bishop Wordsworth's School in Salisbury. In 1940, he took a break from teaching to serve in the British Royal Navy during World War II. He actually saw a lot of action in World War II. He served on a destroyer that was involved in the sinking of the Bismarck, which was a German battleship. He saw action in Walcheren in the fall of 1944, a time when 27 assault craft would enter the water and only 17 would leave. Most notably, he participated in the famous D-Day invasion on the beaches of Normandy, where he commanded an aircraft that fired rockets onto the beaches. I think it's important to note his service because World War II unleashed a crazy set of horrors onto the world. As a member of the British Royal Navy in World War II, he was unfortunately surrounded by death and saw the world enter one of the deadliest periods in history, and he was on the front lines for it. He was there for the aftermath of the Holocaust and saw as civilized states fell to the horrors of totalitarianism. So it makes sense that his experiences in the war really altered the way he views the world and people and human nature. And he wrote about how World War II transformed his views of the world in one of his journal entries. Before the Second World War, I believed in the perfectibility of social man. But after the war, I did not. I began to see what people were capable of doing. Anyone who moved through those years without understanding that man produces evil as a bee produces honey must have been blind or wrong in the head. World War II really impacted the way Golding saw human nature. Perhaps he believed that people were good, and through hard work and effort and socialization and adopting to norms and developing morality, that people could become perfect in a way, or at least better than they were before. But after World War II and the atrocities he experienced there, he developed a much more nihilistic and pessimistic view of what humans truly are. World War II exposed him to the dark side of the human heart. What's really scary about World War II, even for us to look back on from a historical standpoint, is how many ordinary citizens became involved and swept up in these atrocities. Take Nazi Germany, for example. You had normal, everyday citizens all of a sudden so riled up and so caught up in the fervor of the political climate that they were willing to turn on their neighbors, their family members, to turn them into their government where they knew that they would surely be killed. The idea that there is a certain evil to the human heart, that everyone has the capacity for wrongdoing, was exposed during World War II. And William Golding noticed that. And it's an idea that would go on to influence his writing in Lord of the Flies. In another journal entry, William Golding went on to say, Nazi Germany was a particular kind of boil which burst in 1939. That was only the same kind of inflamed spot we all of us suffer from. And so I took English boys and said, look, this could be you. This same sentiment about evil lurking in the heart of man was also extensively explored by an author named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a survivor of the Soviet-Russian gulags after World War II. Solzhenitsyn said, gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, and through all human hearts. So, if stories are formed by the mind that writes them, it's understandable why William Golding, who survived the atrocities of World War II and saw evil take place across the world, would write such a dystopian novel about human nature. So now that we know that the dystopian themes of Lord of the Flies possibly came from his experiences in World War II, how did he actually go about writing the book? And what journey did the book go through before it reached readers' shelves? Well, in 1945, William Golding completed his military service, hung up his uniform, and went back to teaching. It was around this time that he started reflecting on a book titled The Coral Island, A Tale of the Pacific Ocean by R.M. Ballantyne. Coral Island is a youth fiction novel about 3 boys who survived a shipwreck and got marooned on a South Pacific island. At the time, Coral Island fit into a popular genre of stories called the Robinsade, which was named after Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. The 3 boys in the story, Jack, Ralph, and Peter, are shipwrecked and marooned on this deserted island. If you've already read Lord of the Flies, you know that the main characters in that story are Jack, Ralph, and Piggy. So right away we can see that William Golding was pretty directly inspired by this book, Coral Island. I personally haven't read Coral Island, but just from looking at a few of the summaries, it looks like it was a pretty typical tale of the 3 boys get shipwrecked. They have some struggles, but in the end, they all come together to cooperate, work together, and get off the island, which, like I mentioned, fit very neatly into the category of the classic Robinsade story. While it's reported that William Golding enjoyed the novel Coral Island, he ultimately found it to be utterly inaccurate in its depiction of human behavior, specifically of how young boys would react in that situation. So Golding wanted to write a book that was more truthful to how he thought boys that age would really behave in a deserted island situation. So he went to his wife and asked, "Would it be a good idea if I wrote a book about children on an island? Children who behave in the way children really would behave." His wife, Anne, loved the new idea, thought it was brilliant, and encouraged him to get cracking on it right away. So while he was still teaching, he began working on a book called Strangers from Within. He sent his book to various publishers, but it was rejected 21 times before it was eventually accepted by Faber and Faber. But Faber and Faber didn't even accept this manuscript with ease. The person from Faber and Faber who initially read the Strangers from Within manuscript was someone named Jan Perkins, and she had rave reviews for Strangers from Within when she first read it, calling it rubbish, dull, and pointless. So Golding was off to a great start. But then a new editor from Faber and Faber named Charles Monteith caught wind of the Strangers from Within manuscript and fell in love with it. Charles came along, saw the potential of Strangers from Within, and asked Sir William Golding if he would be willing to make some changes to the manuscript in order for it to be published through Faber and Faber. Now, when Charles came to Sir Will with this proposal to make changes to the work, I don't know if he filled Will in on exactly how many changes needed to be made. Because by the time Lord of the Flies was actually published, it was basically an entirely different book than what was originally submitted to Faber and Faber. First of all, the entire beginning to the original manuscript was completely different. The original opening described an entire civilization in the throes of nuclear war, but that beginning was completely scrapped. There's a character in Lord of the Flies named Simon who, in the original manuscript, was written entirely differently. Simon originally was written as this symbolic Christ-like figure who on many occasions would speak to God and the devil, and that whole idea of that character was completely scrapped. It was a little too symbolic and ethereal for the publishing house. So after many rounds of edits, the Lord of the Flies manuscript was finally finished. The final manuscript was almost completely different than what was originally submitted by Golding, and we aren't entirely sure if it's something that Golding was satisfied with, because in one of his quotes he stated, "I've lost any kind of objectivity I ever had over this novel, and can hardly bear to look at it." So based on this statement, it's hard to tell if he was really satisfied with this final product, but I think there's a balance to be struck here between sticking to your original vision and having the flexibility to make changes. Golding took the vast edits and recommendations from his editor in stride. When he first submitted this manuscript, Golding was an unknown aspiring author. Because of his willingness to be flexible, he was able to get Lord of the Flies published into the hands of readers and eventually gain notoriety and develop a very, very successful writing career. So what if Sir William Golding wasn't willing to make these changes at the beginning of his career? What if he was very stubborn and hard-nosed about the artistic vision that he had for this manuscript? And what if he told Faber and Faber, when they asked him to make changes, to stuff it? Well, if he would have said that, then Lord of the Flies may never have been picked up. And a brilliant writer like Sir William Golding, with a lot of potential and a lot of talent, would have possibly gone to the grave having published nothing. Not everyone is Stephen King, William Shakespeare, or Jane Austen. Not everyone pumps out perfect stories as easily as they breathe. And if any of you out there are aspiring writers, I think this story about William Golding making these changes, making some sacrifices, is worth hearing because it's a reminder that your original manuscript isn't going to be perfect, but be willing to learn, be willing to be flexible, and maybe one of you out there could be the next Sir William Golding. Who knows? So what makes Lord of the Flies a classic? Why is this book a must-read for people? Why is it taught in classrooms? And why is it read so extensively, selling 14.5 million copies? It's just a book about a bunch of rowdy kids on an island, right? Well, it goes a little bit deeper than that. Good fiction tells a good story, but great fiction uses themes that highlight the human experience. It has something to say. It's telling us something about ourselves or society or morality or any of these complex topics. And that's exactly what Lord of the Flies does. Lord of the Flies is a parable of sorts. It's trying to hold a mirror up to us and show us something about our own selves. And there's a lot of underlying philosophy in the subtext of this book that is really worth delving into to fully understand it and appreciate it better. Now, I know philosophy can be a little dense and a little boring, but in the case of Lord of the Flies, it really is compelling. And it's really compelling when you contrast Lord of the Flies with the book Coral Island that directly inspired Golding to write Lord of the Flies in the first place. Coral Island and Lord of the Flies, at their core, display two fundamentally different views of human nature. The contrast of themes in Coral Island versus Lord of the Flies can be best understood by looking at the work of two historic philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes. The outlook of human nature proposed by Coral Island most closely aligns with the works of Rousseau. In Rousseau's discourse on the origin of inequality of men, he outlined the state of nature, a term he used to describe what life was like before governments and civilizations developed. The state of nature, according to Rousseau, was perfectly suited to mankind and in accordance with how we are meant to live. It's basically who we are supposed to be. Rousseau believed that uncorrupted morals prevail in this so-called state of nature. In nature, where there's no civilization, where there's no society, Rousseau believed that human nature is shown to be inherently good. We are born pure, benevolent, moral creatures, and a life lived close to nature allows us to maintain this status and be uncorrupted. Because in nature we are motivated by a force that Rousseau termed amour de soi. Pardon my French, don't know how to speak French, that's my best pronunciation of it. Amour de soi is a love of self. Rousseau's definition of a love of self was like the bottom rung on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow was a very famous psychologist who studied human motivation and personality. His most famous contribution to psychology is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you see outlined in this pyramid here. He created this pyramid of human needs to suggest that our needs existed in a hierarchy, where you need to satisfy your most basic needs, seen at the bottom of the pyramid, before you can satisfy your more complicated needs, which you see at the top of the pyramid. As long as we could satisfy our most crucial needs, like eating, sleeping, satisfying our thirst, reproducing, then humans could live peacefully without resorting to the power struggles described by Thomas Hobbes, which I'll cover in a couple minutes. So how does Rousseau answer the question of why is there evil in the world? Rousseau believed that the development of civilizations and societies corrupted the individual because societies and civilization brought us further and further away from our state of nature, where we're perfectly aligned with our morality and our humanity. So essentially, people are born good and society corrupts them. In his mind, if you were to take away the social structures that we've developed, which are inherently corrupting, then man can return to its pure moral state with nature. In sum, without social constraints, we thrive. And that's exactly what we see in Coral Island with the characters Jack, Ralph, and Peter. They are stripped of their societal constraints, and as a result, they thrive on this island. They pull together, they cooperate, and they do whatever it takes to live in social harmony on the island while still planning a route for their survival and escape. And that's all well and good for Coral Island. It's probably a great book, but this is not the view that Sir William Golding had about human nature. And his writing in Lord of the Flies more closely aligns with the philosopher Thomas Hobbes. The philosophy developed by Thomas Hobbes regarding human nature was drastically different than Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Hobbes looked at the course of human history and saw the wars, the tribalism, the greed, and the murder, and concluded that human nature is nasty, brutish, and short. But Thomas Hobbes, by studying history, noticed trends that humans were becoming more civilized, less brutish, less murderous, less crime-filled. So he believed that as humans came together, developed civilizations, structured well-functioning governments, that we turned away from our brutish nature. According to him, human nature is inherently brutal, vile, and corrupt. But society and civilization help us tame our brutish ways and draw us closer to morality. So according to Hobbes, if you were to strip away the structure provided by civilization, society, and governments, we would all fall back into that chaos and savagery. And this, my friends, is the perspective that William Golding develops in Lord of the Flies. So Hobbes believed that human-to-human violence still exists in spite of these civilizing structures and institutions because that's who we are, deep down. That dark side of the human heart manifests because we are never content solely in satisfying our own needs. We have a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceases only in death. This desire for domination over one another creates conflict. Government, society, and these civilizing institutions need to exist to prevent people from exercising that power over one another. So in summary, Coral Island aligns with the beliefs of Rousseau that humans are naturally good, and we are corrupted by society. So without the constraints of civilization, we flourish. But then there's Lord of the Flies that takes the view of Thomas Hobbes that believes that humans are naturally corrupt and vile. And if you take away the civilizing institutions of government and society, then we revert to these brutish and nasty and corrupt ways. I think there is a good approach to take while reading this book. So if you're rereading it or diving into it for the first time, I'd like to offer some topics to consider while you're doing your reading. I think it helps to look at this book as a parable of sorts. The story is somewhat biblical, putting humans, young boys specifically, into a situation that forces them to confront their true nature. Civilization and culture gives us structure, customs, and rules. So what happens to us when all that disappears? Who do we become when the rules that organize our lives vanish? Do your beliefs align more with Rousseau and believe that humans are naturally good and society pulls us away from these instincts? Or are humans inherently vile and corrupt like Hobbes believed? And are we doomed to perish without the organizing structures provided by society? These are the questions worth pondering as you go about reading Lord of the Flies. If anyone out there has other suggestions, other insights about things to think about while reading this book, I'd love to hear about your thoughts in the comments, and maybe we can create a discussion about it. Now, I just mentioned some really deep questions to think about while reading Lord of the Flies, things about human nature and philosophy. Great literature holds a mirror up to ourselves and shows us who we really are. It makes us think deeply about ourselves and our own lives, our relationships, and how we function in the world, and things can get pretty deep while you're doing reading in a book like Lord of the Flies. But we can't forget one crucial fact. This book is a story, and stories are supposed to be fun. They're supposed to grab you by the shoulders and take you for a ride. And this is one of the most fun, scary, thought-provoking rides you can possibly go on while reading a book. Stephen King, the master of horror himself, wrote an introduction for the centenary release of Lord of the Flies. I've included a link to the entire introduction in the description, but I'd like to leave you with just a little taste of it, because I think it's a good way to send us off on this Lord of the Flies journey. To me, Lord of the Flies has always represented what novels are for, what makes them indispensable. Should we expect to be entertained when we read a story? Of course. An act of the imagination that doesn't entertain is a poor act indeed. But there should be more. A successful novel should erase the boundary line between writer and reader so they can unite. When that happens, the novel becomes a part of life, the main course, not the dessert. A successful novel should interrupt the reader's life, make him or her miss appointments, skip meals, forget to walk the dog. In the best novels, the writer's imagination becomes the reader's reality. It glows, incandescent, and furious. I agree that This Blew Me Away is pretty much of a non-starter when it comes to class discussion of a novel, but I'd argue it's still the beating heart of fiction. This blew me away is what every reader wants to say when he closes a book, isn't it? What I keep coming back to is Golding saying, "Wouldn't it be a good idea to write a story about some boys showing how they would really behave?" It was a good idea, a very good idea that produced a very good novel, one as exciting, relevant, and thought-provoking now as it was when Golding published it in 1954. My friends, that's all I have for this introduction video, so without further ado, let's read Lord of the Flies together.